Good evening and welcome to everyone joining us tonight for our presentation through the Federation of Jewish Men's Clubs. We have people joining us from the Chicago area and elsewhere. And as is our protocol for these programs, if you have questions of our presenter, Nina Henry, please use the chat and we will field those after her presentation, which is going to focus on mental health and the issues surrounding addiction from a Jewish perspective. Nina's background is quite impressive. She functions as an addiction specialist for the Jewish Center for Addiction, a program of the Jewish Child and Family Services office located in Skokie, Illinois, which is a North Chicago suburb. She received her master's in counseling at Northeastern Illinois University in Chicago and was certified to provide addiction treatment services by the Illinois Certification Board in 1991. From 1995 through the end of 2014, Nina supervised Recovery Point, the substance use program of Community Counseling Centers of Chicago, C4. And previously, she was the senior addiction counselor for the outpatient addiction treatment program at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And before that was an addiction counselor at Evanston Hospital, the Chapman Center. And she has the pedigree, the LCPC and the CADC, which she can go into. Nina is a member of Temple Beth Israel in Skokie, Illinois. And we both serve on the synagogue's officer group. Nina is Vice President of Religion and Culture for Temple Beth Israel. So we'll get the program underway, and Nina, it's your turn. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Norwin, for doing that lovely introduction for me. It made me feel like I'm sort of bigger than I am. And actually, I just pinned my video, so I'm like literally a little bit bigger than I was a moment ago. Thank you all, and thanks to Bruce Fagan and all of you for having me with you tonight. So I just want to sort of add just one thing for all of you to know. I do a lot of different things for JCFS Chicago. I'm, as Norman said, an addiction specialist and a mental health educator. But one thing I do that will be important for all of you at the end of the program to get my name, email, and phone number. One of my big tasks is called information and referral, which means that you can call me, or a member of your congregation can call me about a friend, a colleague, fellow congregant, significant other, someone that you're worried about who's showing, and I'm going to actually be reviewing some signs and symptoms of mental health and substance use issues. So if you become concerned about that person, I've actually been doing information and referral, not just for the greater Chicago area where I'm based, but frankly, I get calls from all over the country and actually even many places elsewhere in the world. I've gotten calls from Canada, Israel, even Luxembourg, if you can believe it. I also have assisted people in California, Tennessee, you name it. So I just really want you to know that that's a particular position I hold and thing that I do for JCFS Chicago that can be helpful to you and yours. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and bring up the PowerPoint I've prepared for this evening. And I'm going to make sure that everything is optimal so that it'll be easy for you to see. So there it is. There is my title page, Tikkun Hanefesh, which actually right before I got on the call with all of you, I was just making sure I was right on time with Tikkun Hanefesh. And what I mean by being right on time, Tikkun Hanefesh can mean a lot of different things. We can loosely translate it as meaning repair of the soul. And it's timely because we're really in Elul now. We're really heading towards the high holiday season. We're practically in it. And so this is always a time for all of us to think about teshuvah and reflection. And so this is a way of reflecting about yourself, mental health, substance use, your community in the so mental health and substance use in the context of the Jewish community, as my subtitle says. So what are we going to do tonight? So let me first of all get my program to move forward. There we go. So here are my goals for tonight. So first, as I promised, I'm going to talk about mental illness and substance use with a Jewish backdrop, right? So what's the historical perspective? We'll talk a little bit about stigma. We'll talk about what's going on currently, not just in the greater Chicago area, but around the country. Then we're actually going to look at what is a mental health problem or a mental disorder, what's a substance use disorder, and kind of loosely what its impact has been across the United States. And I'll reference a little bit with what's been going on during COVID. I don't want to dismiss that big thing that's been going on with all of us for over a year and a half. And also, most importantly, what you and your community can do to meet someone face-to-face who is struggling with substance use and mental health problems. One thing I'd like to encourage you to do, Norwin is going to be monitoring the chat for your questions and comments, but I also would like to really invite you to unmute and ask questions or make comments. I think that makes for a more lively conversation, a more lively presentation. So I really want to encourage you to do that. So let's look right away at mental illness and substance use with a Jewish background. Literally, you've got a Jewish star as your background there. So first of all, we need to talk about, let's go to the Torah, right? So you see there the word meshuga, but more specifically, there is a word in the Torah that refers to mental health problems, shigoan, which literally means crazy. And there may be some of you who have a better grasp of Hebrew than I do, but for all intents and purposes, shigoan refers to people that, and this is found in Deuteronomy for those of you who want to know where the reference comes from. But also there is enough in the Torah that signals to us that madness or being, let's use the Yiddish term meshugana, may even equate to sinfulness. So the Yiddish word meshugana derives from a word found in Deuteronomy, as I mentioned, shigoan, meaning crazy. And actually, on this next piece, there's also the word shota, also found in the Torah, which refers to a wanderer or vagrant. And some interpreters of the Torah even go so far as to say that this might refer to people with psychotic disorders. So that might be people that are hearing things, seeing things, people that are experiencing paranoia, and so forth. And again, it's all, unfortunately, in the Torah, largely a pejorative. There are some places like the story of Hannah, where she's there in the temple and she's muttering to herself because she's been barren and she's praying to God to make her not barren. And she's found by the prophet, and he says, well, what are you, crazy? Why are you muttering to yourself? So even in a context that should be welcoming and favorable, even Hannah is sort of discarded as until she actually gets a chance to tell her story, she's discarded as someone who's different from, right? So all that stigma that even today we talk about in reference to mental health and substance use problems. And that last bullet you see, cannot get married or bear witness, that again dates way back to biblical times. But for those of you who are maybe a little bit more familiar with the Orthodox community here in Chicago, we have a very large Orthodox community right in my neighborhood of West Rogers Park. And in fact, to this day, in many Orthodox communities, history of mental illness or substance use in your family can make it particularly challenging to be considered for a shidduch or a marriage match, right? So someone who has a history of mental illness may be viewed in the Orthodox community as unfavorable for a marriage match. So lots and lots of stigma traditionally in the Jewish community. Things are getting better now, and we can talk about that. But still slowly but surely, we're trying to sort of move out of biblical times into modern times. So another interesting thing I learned the more that I did research on this topic in preparation for this evening is how many Jewish people actually are in the work of mental health and substance use treatment. And here we have the father of modern psychology, a Jewish man, Sigmund Freud, Ellis, the developer of rational emotive behavioral psychology, which is still a very well-known and used approach to mental health and substance use treatment. Beck is the father of cognitive therapy, and to this day, we still use his depression scale when we're assessing whether or not someone has a depressive disorder. And probably, for those of you who are educators, probably know about Erikson's stages of development, because he is really one of the backbones of this idea of knowing, what stages of development a child might be in. Adler, in Chicago, at least, there's an Adler Institute. So Adler is really at the top of his field. And many of you have heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is a foundational set of ideas that lots and lots of mental health treatments have been based on. And the question I would ask, and certainly this is a good moment for you either to unmute or put something in the chat, is why do you suppose that Jewish thinkers gravitated towards this field of endeavor, towards mental health and substance use treatment? Why would Jewish people in particular go in that direction? Any thoughts? And certainly Norwin, look and see if anyone puts anything in the chat about that. Or someone can unmute if they want to jump in. I'll give it a couple of seconds.
Nothing in the chat yet.
Thanks, Norwin.
Okay.
So let me go ahead and read this. I have one idea that I found written in Psychiatry and Religion, which is actually a professional journal by a fellow named Howard Cooper. And he wrote, Judaism attempts to honor the uniqueness of each individual human being created, as Genesis puts it, in the image and likeness of God. That it is endlessly curious about how human beings actually think, feel, and function. And consequently, within Judaic thought, there's a constant preparedness to call into question received ideas. Boy, if there aren't a lot, for those of you who've studied Talmud, I mean, they pick everything apart. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of questions being debated and questioned all through Jewish study and thought. So it seems really, actually, if you put it in that frame of reference, not surprising that Jewish people are engaged in this field of endeavor. And so they question received ideas, conventional notions, accepted ways of thinking, and categorizing. So the good news is that Jewish people, for the most part, do like to sort of bust out of the envelope, right? Sort of like to expand our horizons in thought and in ideas. So now I want to kind of move to a specific area of concern of Jews and mental health. And that's that idea of trauma. Of course, the first thing we think about is the Holocaust and Holocaust survivors. And it's kind of an interesting set of questions to ruminate about, because even though many of our Holocaust survivors, many of them are well into their 80s and 90s and sadly are passing away, but the reality is that there are some genetic carry-throughs, and I'll explain that as we go through this. So, of course, Jewish people have a long history of trauma. It didn't start with the Holocaust. It started with, again, biblical times, being exiled to Babylon. We, of course, recently observed the destruction of the temple. So all kinds of history of trauma, persecution, exile is something that we're very sadly accustomed to. Yet, and this is really important, and actually whenever we talk about substance use and mental health issues, we always have to talk about the resilience of people. If we don't believe that people have resilience and the ability to survive, it's hard to imagine that they could change their lives by virtue of treatment or therapy. So we always have to recognize that the Jews have survived because they're tenacious and resilient and determined. So I think that you can't talk about Jews and trauma without mentioning that. And also, growing research indicates that historical persecution and multi-generational trauma evokes a pattern of behavioral responses, what's referred to in my field of endeavor as epigenetic trauma. And in fact, for children of Holocaust survivors, there's been quite a bit of research that shows that children of Holocaust survivors are predisposed to post-traumatic stress disorder. So they have a predisposition to trauma. So they're already disposed before they engage in life. They oftentimes, children of Holocaust survivors have difficulty with separation and becoming their own person, their own individual. Maybe have a little bit more vulnerability to stress and, so for instance, I actually have a client who is the child of Holocaust survivors, and she's in my group because of the difficulty she's had dealing with the isolation of the pandemic. So in fact, she demonstrated what research has demonstrated, that children of Holocaust survivors do have a little bit more difficulty dealing with stressors. However, again, to return to that idea of resilience, they also, again, this is founded in research, show a particular resilience and ability to kind of roll with the punches. So before I go too much further, I want to talk really briefly about where this all comes up in media and films and what the world has absorbed about the Jewish community and mental health, that people that are not necessarily Jewish. So a classic misperception, as an example, about Jewish people exists and became universally accepted with Woody Allen's portrayal of the anxious and neurotic Nebush, the person, usually a man, who was regarded as pitifully ineffectual, timid, or submissive. I would posit that this is, of course, an absolute misconception, yet, thanks or no thanks to Woody Allen, became a fairly widely accepted premise about some Jewish men. And I don't think many of us want to accept that as a given, right? So I also want to say that some of these misconceptions are definitely not limited to the Jewish community. And of course, stigma, first and foremost, and one thing that we all should be concerned about, and I'll address throughout the program, is stigma causes people to hide their problems. It causes people to stay in the dark. And, if people don't get help for their problems, they don't get better. In fact, they get worse. And so the question becomes, how do they get help? Well, I have a couple of ideas for you. All of these programs listed under community programs some of them may be based in Chicago, but they're all universally accessible throughout the nation. I put on top of this a program that I've collaborated with this organization. They are quite something. It's called No Shame on You. Their entire mission is to help reduce stigma against people with mental health and substance use problems. And I heartily encourage you, if you Google that name, you will find No Shame on You, again, based in the Chicago area, but doing programs nationwide. Refuat Hanefesh is sort of a clearinghouse. So if you want to find out about various referrals, resources and referrals, Refuat Hanefesh is a place to go. If you're familiar with some women, and particularly women in the Orthodox community, Kazkenu and La Briut offer online, in Zoom conversations, groups for women, like support groups for women who are struggling with mental health and substance use issues. Relief, again, like Refuat Hanefesh, offers referrals and resources. Elijah's Journey was founded by a man named Ephraim Epstein in 2009 to create a Jewish voice within the greater national suicide prevention effort. As you might imagine, Elijah's Journey has sadly been much more busy during the pandemic, as you may have read in your local newspaper or have heard from people with whom you're acquainted. The suicide rate sadly has increased during the pandemic due to people's feelings of isolation. Their depressive disorders and other such disorders have been intensified by isolation, by lack of connection, by so much anxiety and confusion about what's going on in the world. So Elijah's Journey is for that topic alone, is a really important organization to have awareness about. Beit Teshuvah is probably the only Jewish-based and really formal substance use treatment program in the United States. While Chabad and others have made sort of stabs at providing Jewish treatment, Beit Tshuva has actually sort of conquered that and have learned how to do it very effectively. And JCFS Chicago has partnered with Beit Tshuva on a number of projects, including developing a program for kids that are in 6th through 7th grade to help, basically as a prevention program to help kids avoid using substances. The Midbar is a wonderful sort of an outward bound program for people struggling with substance use. So you go, they're based in Colorado, you go out into the wilderness and conquer your fears out in the wilderness, and at the same time, conquer your addiction. So that's the Midbar. And finally, and this is the newest program of all of these listed, the Blue Dove Foundation has really, they're based in Atlanta, Georgia, and they have done numerous programs similarly to No Shame on You to again break stigma and really increase awareness about mental health and substance use problems. And they too deal with drug overdose and suicide in particular. They're quite eloquent on those topics. So I'm going to switch gears again. Before I do so, I just want to check in with Norwin. Has anyone put anything in the chat that I should be aware of?
It is open, but nothing yet.
Okay, and again, I encourage all of you, if you want to jump in and say, Nina, I don't get it, and want to ask a question, by all means, please do. So what is the mental disorder? Yes.
Can you relate how some of our forefathers or mothers, however you want to put it, have affected what we, and who they are and how they've affected basically Jewish tradition and where we are today with the mental illness? I know that where we think maybe Judaism has as much mental illness more than anyone else, I think we're not any different than any other organizations. We're probably the same. It's just where it came from is different. So I wondered if you could relate that.
Well, I can't be as specific as you might hope with regard to specific forefathers and foremothers, our ancestors, except in, as I said early on, there was unfortunately more pejorative language around the idea of mental disorders or mental illness or substance use. To reference Noah as an example, Noah's sons in the chapters about Noah castigate their father for his drunkenness and are very angry with him for being drunk when he's supposed to, of course, leading them in this mission to a new world beyond the one that was destroyed in the flood. I mentioned the story of Hannah, of course, who is accosted by the prophet Elijah because she's mumbling to herself about her barrenness, and he, at first, takes her for someone who's, to use a pejorative term, crazy, when in fact he learns that she's nothing of the sort. And ultimately, thank goodness, and this is much to his credit, he says, oh, this is someone who really needs to be helped, and in turn does do so. But I think, unfortunately, too frequently, our forefathers and foremothers really, and it's not out of any kind of malice, right? It's really out of ignorance and not understanding where the behavior comes from, that people were set aside, much in the same way as people with leprosy were set aside, people with mental illness and substance use problems were set aside and away from the rest of the community, hence building that stigma. And one other thing I want to address in your question, and thanks, by the way, for having the courage to speak up, is in fact, when I first started with JCFS Chicago, the general myth, particularly about substance use, not so much about mental health, but substance use in particular, was that Jews didn't experience it as the same rate as everybody else, and that it was to a lesser extent. But I have scads of research from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, from the National Institute on Drug Abuse. The Jewish folks basically experience it at the same rate as all the rest of the United States population. Essentially, 1 in 10 of us struggle with substance use issues, and close to 20% of us, sometimes as many with regard to severe mental illness, 25%, 25% of people in general in the United States report, get diagnosed every year. Jewish people, again, are pretty much at the same rate. And I actually have a grid that I'll show you in a minute that kind of breaks out some of the major mental health problems. We pretty much, the Jewish community pretty much suffers these illnesses and disorders at the same rate as everybody else. There might be slight differences. We know, for instance, that Native Americans suffer substance use at a greater percentage. We know that people, and again, all of this is based on research. I'm not telling you anything that isn't, well researched. We also know that people of Irish descent do experience substance use issues at a slightly higher rate. But again, on average, in the United States, 1 in 10 substance use, 1 in 20 mental health problems. So I'm going to move back to my prepared remarks. And if there's more questions, just throw them in the chat or again, have the courage to unmute. I hope that answered your question. So what is a mental disorder? And that actually, if anyone wants to throw that answer into the chat or pipe up, I'm happy to hear what you think it might be without my revealing my bullets ahead of time. Any thoughts? Well, I'm going to barrel right through and you can interrupt me if you want, but basically it's all about functioning. How a person's mental condition is apprised or assessed has to do with how well they're functioning. Are they thinking normally, right? Are they hearing things or seeing things? If they are, that's a thinking disorder. Are they in an emotional state, right? We all know about depression and anxiety. Some of us even know about bipolar disorder, which are extreme emotional states. And of course, there's behavior that might seem odd or out of the ordinary, but most importantly, and if you think of the people who may be suffering with a mental health problem, think about how they're just functioning on a day-to-day basis. Are they showing up, if it's a family member, are they showing up for family events, whether it's on Zoom or in person? If you're working with this person, are they showing up on time? Are they getting their job done properly? If you're a teacher and you have students and you're on Zoom, is the kid really, let's face it, a lot of kids on Zoom were kind of zoning out. So it's kind of hard to tell which kid that's zoning out is having an emotional problem and which kid that's zoning out is actually just being a kid. But generally, functioning and how they're functioning on a continuum, mild, moderate, severe, is how we think about assessing and determining whether or not someone has a mental disorder or mental illness. So these things might disrupt their ability to work. How about hygiene? Are they able to just get in the shower every day or brush their teeth? And are they engaging in satisfying relationships? Are they engaging in any relationships at all? So these are the ways that we professionals, and by the way, Norwood mentioned my initials. So LCPC is Licensed Clinical Professional Counselor, in case you were curious, and CADC is an alcohol and drug counselor. So I'm certified alcohol and drug counselor. Sorry for that sidebar. So again, we're talking about the level of functioning. Is the person functioning normally? So the question you might ask, is it a disease? And that's harder to answer than you might imagine because, again, we want to avoid stigmatizing people and being pejorative. So I tend, for the most part, not to talk about these problems as a disease. And I would encourage you as non-professionals who maybe want to help people in your community that you maybe want to think disease in the back of your head because indeed some mental illnesses can be easily characterized as diseases. And I'll explain to you why in a moment. But when we're talking to a person we're trying to help, we don't want to really underscore that. We want to really underscore our concern for their welfare. That's really where we want to go. So there are a number of things that we want to look at when we think of mental illness and mental disorders. First of all, the idea of inherited traits, which I've already referenced a little bit. So mental illness is more common in people whose blood relatives have a mental illness. I've already mentioned that. Certain genes may increase your risk of developing a mental illness, and your life situation may trigger that problem. So for instance, I may be born with a genetic trait for, say, alcoholism, but I don't fall into that pattern of behavior until something maybe somewhat traumatic happens in my life. Like maybe I lose a parent at an early age, and that maybe triggers that predisposition for that substance use or mental health problem. So that's how inherited traits might interplay. Of course, environmental exposures before birth, this is to a lesser degree implicated in how mental illness and mental health problems develop. But exposure to environmental stressors, inflammatory conditions, toxins, alcohol, and drugs while in the womb can sometimes be linked to mental illness. There is some reasonably good research, and I say reasonably good because it's not conclusive, that mothers who are using cocaine while a baby is in utero, the baby can develop some long-term behavioral problems. We also know that if a mother is using opiates like heroin while a child is in utero, the baby can literally be born with that addiction. And one of the dangers of that is that the child has to be, safely withdrawn from the drug that they didn't actually use except in utero. So it's kind of a scary situation. I'm happy to say that that's the exception, not the rule, but it does happen. But this last one, I'd say is the biggest one that's implicated in terms of defining mental illness as a disease. So many of you may be familiar with the term neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are naturally occurring brain chemicals that carry signals to other parts of your brain and body. When the neural networks involving these chemicals are impaired, and that would be the case with depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and lots of mental health problems, the function of nerve receptors and nerve systems change, leading to depression and other mental disorders. So neurotransmitters are probably, if we're going to implicate any criminal, and I don't like to really use that term when I'm talking about mental illness, but if we're going to point to anything that really points to mental health problems as related to a disease process, it would be these neurotransmitters, this brain chemistry. For those of you who might be curious, with substance use, it's even more specific. There's a part of your brain, which is sort of almost a sort of prehistoric part of your brain that is referred to as the mesolimbic dopamine system. You may have heard other references to this, the pleasure center, the pleasure pathway. So this is a portion of the brain that reacts in a very particular way to addictive substances, and essentially, without giving you a lot of mumbo jumbo and scientific jargon, the brain becomes convinced that it cannot survive without that substance, that addictive substance like alcohol, heroin, cocaine, or some prescription drugs like Adderall and Ativan and others like that. So before I move on, because this is a little bit more complicated than what I've mentioned before, is there anyone who has any questions about this particular area of concern? You're all brilliant. You all understand either that or I'm brilliant and you understand everything I'm telling you. So before I go to the next slide, I want you in your head to guess what you might think the most prevalent mental health issue is, including whether or not you think substance use is. So think in your head, what's the number one top problem, that people in the United States contend with? So I'll give you a second to think about it, maybe even throw it in the chat if you want. Okay, I've given you a minute or two, so here they are. So this was 2019, but I have checked, and the reason it's 2019 and not 2021 is it takes a long time for us to collate research that we've done, but I did have access to a less well collated chart to make sure that these are in line with our current situation. What I will say is some of these things are at a higher rate now because of the pandemic, but this is pretty consistent year after year that these are the percentages that we see. So even if they're not exactly the same now, we know absolutely incontrovertibly that anxiety disorder is the most frequently experienced mental disorder. And this, by the way, this particular chart is by report. So if you'll look at that white italics writing at the bottom of this slide, you'll see only 41% of people with a mental illness use mental health services in any given year. So, you know, more than 50% of the people that might have a mental health problem or a substance use problem aren't even telling us. So this is just the people. Yes. Does someone want to say something? Okay, thought I heard something. Forgive me. So, so even though these are pretty good numbers, and I think they do represent even the people that haven't reported, this is pretty much very consistent with what's going on. There may be some surprises for you. I know that when I first looked at this data, I was surprised to see that depressive disorder was as low a percentage as it is. And frankly, I think the substance use disorder percentage is low as well. I think it's closer to 12%, especially right now. We know that there's been a 30% increase in overdose, and overdose deaths have increased dramatically as well. And you've probably heard about that in the newspapers and magazines and on the radio. All kinds of news media is reporting these things. Bipolar disorder, if anything, is slightly lower than what's represented here. And that's because for a period of time during the 2010s, that research is now telling us that bipolar disorder was likely overdiagnosed. So now some of these people are reporting diagnoses that may not be accurate. So we think the bipolar disorder is a little lower than this. And finally, because of a lot of media reports about people with schizophrenia engaging in violent actions, we tend to think of schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders as being much more prevalent than this, but it's, as you can see, less than 1% of the population reports these problems. Of course, because of stigma, of all the disorders, I think people would be least likely to report that they have a psychotic disorder because of all the stigma against it. But I just want to share with you one very important thing, which most people sadly don't know, is that people with psychotic disorders like schizophrenia are much more likely to be the victims of crimes rather than the perpetrator of crimes. In fact, we know that, again, from research with certainty. And if you're curious, I research on the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, and I think that's on the mental health resources that I asked Norman to send out to all of you. So if you haven't received it yet, please make sure you ask Norman to send that to you. So the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, the National Institute on Mental Health, the National Institute on Drug Abuse. I also, for a lot of my medical research, I look at Mayo Clinic quite a bit. The Kaiser Family Foundation has excellent research on these topics. So, you know, have a ball on Google, look all of these up because they're really important. So let me just talk a minute about a little bit more about these numbers. So again, this is by report and does not count people who do not seek treatment. This only represents a period, as it says, of 1 year, and in this case, 2019, but it is not dissimilar to 2021, allowing for the fact that some things are higher because older adults, by the way, are reporting mental illness at a rate 40% higher than previously. So definitely with older adults, we're seeing an uptick in report of mental health problems. Again, that's in the Jewish community as well as the greater United States population. Not everyone knows they have a mental illness, right? People may be feeling a sense of disorder in their lives and feel like they're not coping as well. They don't necessarily report it because they don't know that they have a mental health problem or a substance use problem for that matter. People, again, because of stigma, don't seek help because they are embarrassed or feel ashamed. And people do, and actually this is a research data that I think is a sad commentary. Sometimes people may have a sense that they have a mental health problem, but don't seek treatment until 10 years after they begin to recognize there's a problem. So people may wait as long as 10 years to seek treatment. But we also have to be aware, and you can see this is borne out in these numbers, that these disorders are more common than cancer, diabetes, or heart disease. So these are very, very prevalent things in our society. So I think this might be obvious, but I'm going to run through these bullets anyway. Why learn about mental health? Well, I just told you they're very common. I've talked about stigma. Many people are not well informed about mental health problems, so that's part of the reason why I'm with you tonight. And here's a problem. We certainly have learned during COVID times that we have not enough doctors, not enough nurses. Well, guess what? We don't have enough mental health providers. And frankly, even if we had one in our community, they're not always on hand when we need them. As an example, just today, my senior director was talking about a rabbi who called her at like 10 o'clock in the evening because he didn't know who to call to help him with a congregant who was expressing suicidal thoughts. So sometimes a professional is not readily available. In this case, the rabbi felt, well, you know, seems like an emergency to me, so I'm going to call the one person I know. But frankly, we weren't on the clock. We weren't, you know, readily available when needed. Fortunately, my supervisor was available to this particular rabbi. And people often, and this is something I'm hoping to help you with a little bit tonight, is people often don't know how to respond. What do I do? How do I help this person? What do I say? I don't know how I can be helpful to this person. And people with mental health, as I said, do not often. Sometimes it takes up to 10 years for them to seek help. I've talked a lot about all of this. I want to make sure we get to our talk about what we can actually do for the people in our community. But briefly, these are some mental health problems that you might encounter. As you saw, anxiety is probably the most frequently encountered. I mean, some of you without an anxiety disorder may have experienced a panic attack in your life. That doesn't necessarily mean you have a disorder, but panic attacks are common in general. A lot of people, because of COVID, have expressed a lot of depression because of the isolation and disconnection from loved ones and from their community. I mentioned how substance use has increased. And also, I haven't talked much about eating disorders, but we know that those are slightly on the increase amongst particularly young, sort of teenage women and emerging adult females. But in case you didn't know, eating disorders also do tend to happen amongst men as well as women, boys as well as girls. So before I go too much further, I just want to make sure that everybody has gotten what they need with regard to learning just about mental disorders and substance use. Anything that you feel like you really need to know before I go forward? Anything in the chat, Norwin?
No.
Okay. Also,
I do have a question.
Yes.
With respect to service veterans in the armed forces that come out from their years in battle and so forth, where do these people fall in with the various disorders that you're describing?
I'd say probably amongst veterans of the service that the two disorders, one that's not listed here, although it's a fairly prevalent disorder, the two places where they're most affected is post-traumatic stress disorder. As we're learning about brain injury and brain trauma, and a lot of that, kind of goes hand in hand. They don't necessarily have to have brain trauma to have post-traumatic stress disorder. So PTSD, and this dates back all the way to the Vietnam veterans, but it's not exclusive to Vietnam for those of you who are as old as me and remember the discussions we used to have about that, but also substance use disorders. And it's sort of almost inextricable from the trauma piece, substance use. And you may experience this even among friends and family. A lot of times people will say that they're drinking or using a drug or using, and nowadays because it's legal in so many places, using marijuana to cope with emotional distress. And of course, substance use, in a legal recreational context really shouldn't have anything to do with using over distressing emotions. It's mostly just to kick back and relax and have fun. But really, it's, amongst veterans in particular, they're using substances to kind of blank out the distressing memories that they may have from their service. Does that answer your question,
Yeah,
Norwin?
yes. And can you comment on the wave of youth suicides?
Well-
It seems like there's an increasing number of rather promising academic, successfully attaining high school kids. Are all already ready
Yes.
to get ready for college. They've gotten scholarships from A to Z from all sorts
Right.
of universities, and then their life seems to go haywire, and they
Yes.
they
Yes.
they end it.
Yes. Certainly, I'm going to speak only briefly about COVID, and then I'm going to speak about really someone who's an authority on this particular topic. Certainly, the pandemic, again, being taken away from friends, being taken away from normal school activities, and being told that, their accomplishments in the first year of COVID was going to be less than what they might have otherwise expected. A lot of them couldn't go to prom, couldn't go to graduation, couldn't do a lot of the things that are just sort of normal for teenagers in particular. So certainly those aspects of COVID definitely prompted an increase in suicidality. But there's a gal, I think you will remember that I mentioned a substance use treatment program out in California called Beit Teshuvah, House of Return. And even though her name doesn't sound Jewish, she is a Jewish lady. Harriet Rosetto is one of their founders. She founded the program, gosh, it's probably 50 years ago now. And she has done extensive research and writing about what she calls the trauma of privilege. And she looks at kids from more affluent families like we experienced, for instance, in the Chicago North Shore. And some of you may in your own, respective vicinities also be in places where there's maybe a little bit more affluence. And kids have such intense expectations, to graduate, and get into the Stanfords and the Princetons and the Harvards and so forth, MIT and so forth. I know, for instance, my own niece, she ultimately graduated from Harvard, but didn't start there. She got into MIT, but when she was refused by Stanford, she practically had a nervous breakdown. She was so, I can't go back to school. I can't tell my friends. All my friends got into Stanford except for me. And she's a kid that has some depressive issues, but she didn't contemplate dying by suicide. But another kid, maybe with a slightly less supportive environment or with maybe a predisposition, as I talked about earlier, to depression, might have, under the same circumstances, made a decision to die by suicide. So I think that there is inordinate pressure, especially on affluent kids, to succeed. Again, that idea of the trauma of privilege, but then also, and this is borne out in what's called ACEs studies, and I don't remember what the acronym stands for, but the ACEs studies are a nationwide, very well-researched study on kids that grew up in environments like Cabrini Green in Chicago, and sort of ghetto kind of neighborhoods and lower income Black and brown communities, and also looked at the extent to which poverty and racism can also contribute. And of course, we know during the pandemic, all of those things have surfaced even to a greater degree. And we think for the kids that are dying by suicide in those communities, poverty and racism have played a really big part. I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure. So how do I approach someone? So that's a big switch for you. I don't want to shock you too much, but I suspect that all of you have at one time or another had a loved one, a friend, family member, fellow congregant who you were really concerned about. And it actually, yes, I've been trained. I've had, years of training in what I do. I'm not expecting any of you to be psychotherapists, but it's easier than you might imagine to approach someone and begin to move them towards help. Obviously, you're going to move them towards professional help eventually, but just opening the conversation might increase the number of people that actually seek. Remember, I said it's only 41% of all people with mental health problems actually seek treatment. So I'm calling upon all of you, I'm deputizing all of you to try your best to increase that percentage. So first and foremost, accept, right? So there might be people in your, I see that I'm at 5 minutes away from ending this, so I'm gonna unfortunately have to run through this a little bit quickly, but think of someone in your own community that maybe acts a little oddly. Be prepared to accept those oddities and be willing to approach that person. Of course, be yourself, be genuine, show that you really care. And in fact, just saying you care makes a big difference. If you say, you know, I'm worried about you, I'm concerned about you, if it's someone you know well, I love you, those kinds of expressions can really make people feel as though you really genuinely care about them. And try to understand the symptoms for what they are. They might seem odd, the behaviors might seem out of pocket and really weird to you, but just understand that it doesn't come from a pejorative, negative place. In most cases, it's not even, they don't feel like they can control those symptoms. And empathy is really a big deal. So I'm going to kind of, of course, empathy is walking around in someone else's shoes, someone else's moccasins, right? Getting into their shoes and trying to feel like what it's like to be them. So if someone tells you, I'm really traumatized by this pandemic because I've been so alone, my children live in other states, I haven't been able to see them, I have an immunodeficiency disorder, so I can't get vaccinated, so I'm really isolated. So you as an empathetic person could say, oh, that must be so distressing for you and how lonely you must feel. Just that acknowledges how they feel and makes them feel, again, respected, accepted, and understood. I'm sorry to whiz through this. I think I talked too much on the earlier stuff, and I don't really want to give short shrift to this important material. So I'm actually going to show you all of these things really quickly. What your community can do is educate your community. If you want, bring me in to do some education, right? I'm happy to provide some education for your community about mental health and substance use. Certainly, we're all talking a lot these days about inclusivity. We certainly are talking about with regard to race, LGBTQ, and inclusion there, but also, inclusion of people with substance use and mental health problems. Congregational mapping is kind of a complex idea. To break it down very simply, know what's going on in your community. Who's living alone? Who are the older adults that don't have kids in the area that might need a meal here and there, or might need getting a ride to synagogue when it's dark because they're not driving at night anymore. So just kind of knowing, which parents are single parents, which parents, are adopting kids, so congregational mapping means just knowing what's going on in your community. And of course, giving voice to the people with mental health problems. Right now, JCFS Chicago is developing what we call Mental Health Shabbat. And we're going to invite synagogues to participate. It'll be in January, and we're inviting them to develop their own mental health Shabbat, and actually maybe even invite members of their community to talk about their lived experience of mental health. So I'm going to put that up there again in a minute, but I'm going to stop share. Oh, there you all are. So nice to see you. And I'm going to share one other document, review it very quickly, and then I'm going to sort of end because I know it's getting late. So let me see if I can find, there it is. So this is something that we developed for a program that we call Safer Synagogues at JCFS Chicago, but it's how you create a safe and welcoming sacred community. So here, this actually talks specifically about substance use, but you could probably substitute the word mental illness or mental health problems for any of the words here. But actually, maybe sitting with your leadership and developing policies and procedures for how you're going to welcome people with these issues into your community and be more inclusive. Prayer that you're doing, and is there parity? Maybe say Misha Berach, not just for the people who are having physical illnesses, but mental illness issues or substance use issues as well. Again, education, raising awareness. Certainly leadership about how to approach congregants with these issues, youth drug prevention programs, youth suicide prevention programs, and having programs for the parents and for the youth about all of these things. Again, I apologize. I'm going to stop share again because I know it's getting late and I don't want to end later than you've planned to end. I know we started a little bit later, but I just want all of you to be thoughtful about how do I get this stuff into my community? How do we begin talking about how to include people with mental health problems and substance use problems? Like, just as an example, whenever you're holding a program, maybe as for instance at Temple Beth Israel, where Norwin and I belong, we have a gala every year, but we always are certain to have, if there's going to be a special gala cocktail, we're going to offer a non-alcoholic version of that same cocktail. When you're having kiddush, make sure juice is available. If you're naming a program, maybe whiskey and wisdom, even if you're going to have some shots of whiskey, maybe that's not the way to invite people to that program, right? Maybe we need to actually offer them something, another way of referring to it. So the focus isn't the alcohol, the focus is the wisdom they'll be gaining from enjoying that program. So I'm going to shut up now and let Norwin and Bruce kind of help me wrap things up.
Nina, could you comment on the programs that we offer, through the member outreach where we check on
Oh, sure. So during the pandemic in particular, and this is something actually.
Or the polar vortex
Pardon?
Or the polar vortex, when people were isolated.
Right. So so it doesn't have to be pandemic for this to happen, which is one of the reasons why I talked about congregational mapping. For instance, at JCFS Chicago and at TBI, we have what we call sharing conversations, right? We actually had a cadre of people at Temple Beth Israel. I can't remember exactly how many, probably was more than a dozen. And I think even more frequently than quarterly, calling just almost I think we pretty much split up the entire congregation and we just called, this was just member to member. We just called to say, hey, this is Nina Henry. Hey, this is Norwin Merens. I'm a fellow Temple Beth Israel member. Here we are in the midst of this pandemic. Here we are in the midst of this polar vortex. And I know you can't go anywhere and can't see anyone. How are you doing? I'm concerned about your welfare. And you'd be surprised, even though, again, a lot of people, because of stigma, are afraid to open up. If you start off saying, I care about you, I'm concerned about you, our community of Temple Beth Israel, a community of Shir Tikva, a community of Anshe Sholem, whatever the name of your community is, we really want to know that you're okay. And if you're not, we're going to try and connect you with help. We're going to connect you with a rabbi if you need to have a spiritual conversation. We're going to connect you with a professional if you think that's what you need, or we're going to connect you with a support group. If you don't feel like getting professional help, there's a plethora of very good support groups out there for people with, say, bipolar disorder. Certainly you've all heard of Alcoholics Anonymous. There's also an organization called Smart Recovery. So there's lots and lots of ways that you can be supportive of your community.
Thank you.
You are welcome.
I just wanted to note, I don't know if before the meeting tonight, Norwin mentioned to you that FJMC, through the FJMC Foundation for Jewish Life,
Yes.
started a new program called Imagine Life, which is a mental wellness initiative that really is, it's geared to help our families and members dealing with anxiety, depression, addiction, and suicide.
Fantastic.
And so it's wonderful to that this is coming. It's coming out because for so long people couldn't talk about this.
Right. Right. So kind of opening the windows and doors and letting in the fresh air, right? Letting people know they're truly, I talked at probably a greater length than I should have about the disease. You know what? If 1 in 5 of us are having mental health problems, this is not so uncommon, right? We shouldn't feel so alone. If this is something that we're struggling with, you are, and actually NAMI right now, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, is having a campaign called You Are Not Alone, right? And their message is that no one has to suffer alone. And in fact, it is really so much more common than people are aware.
And what about the comments that the media divulged recently about the Olympic gymnast, Simone?
One of my personal heroes now. I already really admired her. Thank you for raising that, Norwin. And also Naomi, what's her name? Naomi Osaka, I believe is her name, the Japanese young woman. So yes, Simone Biles and Naomi Osaka coming out and talking about their struggles. Actually, I read some research not so long ago by a fellow that's native to Chicago, who wrote about the fact that people speaking of their lived experience is the surest way to break stigma. So if at your respective congregations, you know of someone in your midst who has the willingness to talk about their own struggles with mental health or substance use issues, this can bring people out of the woodwork. This will encourage other people to share their stories. That's how, that's why Simone Biles is just such a huge hero, not just because of her athletic prowess, but because of her mental health openness. So thanks for raising that, Norman. I appreciate it.
Are there any other questions or comments for Nina?
This is Cass Friedberg. Do you refer people to 12-step groups? Are they compatible with Jewish values as far as you're concerned, how those groups are run?
I'm so glad you asked that question. Actually, a lot of people shy away from 12-step recovery because of, frankly, it was founded with a great influence of Christian principles. So there's quite a few Jewish folks that find that uncomfortable. You may have remembered that I mentioned something called Smart Recovery, and that's a nationwide program, very accessible in almost every, not just major cities, but smaller towns. And that's a program that really does not talk about religion at all. So it's pretty much devoid of religious talk. And then in some isolated places, there are programs. In Chicago, we have what's called JACS. I don't remember the precise what the acronym means, but essentially it is substance use recovery for people who are Jewish. So we have a group that's based in Skokie, but they do all of their meetings on Zoom. And I'm going to actually go ahead and share screen again so I can show that I think it was my last slide, so that you can actually get my contact information. If you're interested in JACS, please contact me at ninahenry@jcfs.org, or you can call me on my office phone. And no matter what, even if I'm not at the office, I get an email with a voicemail that tells me you've called. But there are a number of Jewish programs. There's one on the East Coast that's really fantastic called the Tshuva Center. Again, that idea of return or redemption. And now I'm going to stop share, and I can put this stuff also in the chat. I'm going to put that down, the Tshuva Center, and it's based in New York. And they have meetings now 5 times a week for people who are Jewish and in recovery from substance use problems. So that's, you can Google that just like it's written there, and it'll come up on your Google search. And then let me also put, again, my email, so that if you have more questions, you can feel free to contact me, and my phone number.
And if there are people on the call that represent FJMC clubs who would like to contact Nina to give this presentation or a similar one in their geographic locale, I'm not her speaking agent here, but we
You're doing a great job though, Norwin.
But we certainly want to get the word out that she is available, and obviously this type of program is needed throughout the FJMC universe out there.
And I do speak on a number of topics. If you just want to have a chat about marijuana, I can speak about that. If you have an older adult group in your synagogue and you think they maybe need to hear how to use their medication safely, I have a program called Empower that focuses on that. I have a longer program about understanding mental health, which is 2 hours or 4 hours or even an 8-hour program if you want that. That's a lot of me. I don't know if you want to do 8 hours, but I have done that. So please, you hopefully have my information now. And by the way, there's no backslash after my phone number, just dial the phone number.
To conclude, we want to thank Nina Henry for her wonderful presentation this evening. And sincerely, it was an outstanding program, and we thank you for your time and support of the FJMC, which represents the Federation of Jewish Men's Clubs throughout the United States, Canada, and beyond. If you have suggestions for programs or the timing of programs that works best for you and others, let us know, and we will work to accommodate. Again, thank you to Nina, and wishing everyone a happy, healthy new year.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. It was great to meet you all. And I'm just really grateful always for the opportunity to reduce stigma against mental health problems. So thanks again.